Imagine a civilization so advanced, so powerful, it seemed as though it could never fall. Atlantis, a place of wisdom, peace, and spiritual enlightenment. But what if I told you that angels, being sent to protect and guide this great civilization, didn't save Atlantis? They destroyed it? What if these divine beings, the very ones tasked with keeping balance and order, were the catalyst for its collapse? The angels, once seen as guardians of light, were the ones who corrupted the hearts and minds of the Atlanteans. Instead of guiding them to eternal peace, these angels taught the Atlanteans forbidden knowledge, secrets of unimaginable power, knowledge that was never meant for human hands. The angels' guidance, instead of raising the Atlanteans to higher spiritual levels, pushed them toward a path of greed, destruction, and chaos. What went wrong? How did the very beings who were meant to protect Atlantis become the agents of its downfall? How did these divine protectors, who were given the task to guide a peaceful and flourishing civilization, turn into the very reason for its collapse? For centuries, we've heard stories of the mysterious fall of Atlantis, a civilization that suddenly disappeared, its advanced technologies and wisdom lost to time. But what if the answer isn't as simple as natural disasters or wars? What if the angels who were meant to shield them were the very ones who led them into ruin? As the Atlanteans' power grew, so did their desire for more. The angels, once protectors, started to share secrets of creation, giving the Atlanteans access to forces that they could barely control. Knowledge that gave them the ability to manipulate reality, to control nature, to bend the universe to their will. But in their thirst for power, the Atlanteans didn't just become godlike, they became corrupted. The angels, instead of providing guidance, encouraged the Atlanteans to use their newfound knowledge for domination. Temptation crept into their hearts as they began to abuse the divine gifts given to them. The angels themselves, once paragons of purity, began to bend the very laws of divinity. The guardians became the tempters, their noble mission twisted, and the knowledge they gave the Atlanteans became their greatest curse. And then came the downfall. The once glorious land of Atlantis, known for its wisdom, peace, and technological advancement, sank into the sea, lost forever. The angels who had been sent to guide and protect were now the catalysts of its destruction, their intervention having led the Atlanteans to their end. But was it truly the angels' fault? Or was it the greed and corruption of the Atlanteans themselves that doomed them? Was it the angels who betrayed their sacred mission? Or did they fall into temptation as much as the people they were sent to protect? And if the angels can fall, what does that say about the delicate balance of power and knowledge, and what it takes to avoid the same fate today? In this video, we'll uncover the full story of these fallen angels, their role in Atlantis' destruction, and how their story might hold the key to understanding why civilizations rise and fall, and what happens when divine wisdom and human ambition collide. Atlantis was a place like no other, a land of unimaginable power, wisdom, and beauty, a place that existed far beyond the boundaries of anything we could truly comprehend. It wasn't just a city, it was a civilization where the physical and spiritual realms were interwoven in perfect harmony. It was a place where the divine wasn't just a concept, it was alive, and the people who lived there were deeply connected to it. The Atlanteans weren't like us. Their understanding of the universe, their relationship to the divine forces, and their advanced technology placed them centuries ahead of their time. Imagine a civilization that could harness the energy of the earth, communicate with celestial beings, and tap into divine knowledge that most people could only dream of. They mastered the balance between the physical and the spiritual, living in a state of perfect peace, their minds and hearts always guided by something far greater than themselves. But what made Atlantis truly unique were its guardians, the angels who watched over them. These weren't ordinary angels, the kind we hear about in fairy tales or stories. No, these were beings of immense wisdom and light, sent by the divine to protect and guide the people of Atlantis. These angels didn't just provide spiritual guidance. They were integral to the prosperity of the civilization itself. They were protectors, watching over the Atlanteans as they reached higher levels of enlightenment, guiding them through moments of uncertainty, and ensuring that their wisdom was always grounded in peace. These angels were the bridge between the material and the divine. They didn't simply offer protection from physical threats, but also ensured the spiritual harmony of the civilization. The Atlanteans thrived because they had the guidance of these divine beings who helped them cultivate their relationship with the unseen forces of the universe. They helped build a society where the sacred and the worldly coexisted without conflict. This wasn't just about knowledge, it was about balance. Under the guidance of these celestial beings, the Atlanteans became the most advanced civilization the world had ever known. Their cities sparkled with light, their minds expanded with knowledge, and their hearts resonated with divine love. The technologies they created weren't just based on material understanding, but on the spiritual laws that governed the universe. They understood the laws of energy, the way the stars influence the earth, and how to work in harmony with the natural world. They created technologies that harnessed the power of the elements, allowing them to control storms, move mountains, and even heal the sick. But as with any great story, there is always more to the tale. Beneath the radiance of their prosperity, beneath the golden cities and shining temples, there was a dark side, one that would soon rise to overshadow the light of Atlantis. It wasn't immediately obvious, of course. For centuries, Atlantis remained a place of peace, growth, and prosperity. Their angelic guardians kept them on the right path. But as the Atlanteans' power grew, so did their desire. Their desire for more knowledge, for more control, and for more influence over the forces of the universe. The more they tapped into the divine, the more they began to question the limits of that knowledge. What began as divine guidance soon evolved into human ambition. The more the Atlanteans learned, the more they began to explore powers that were not meant to be understood by mortals. These powers weren't just about technology or energy, they were about changing the very fabric of reality. And that's when the problem began. The angels who had once acted as protectors, who had shared knowledge only when it was in the best interest of the people, started to see their influence shift. Instead of helping the Atlanteans achieve divine wisdom, some angels began to push them toward darker paths, paths that had the potential to disrupt the balance they had worked so hard to maintain. The angels of light began to see their role shift. What was once meant to be divine guidance now became a dangerous temptation. With the increasing desire for power came the growing threat of corruption. The same angelic wisdom that had elevated Atlantis now risked leading it down a path of self-destruction. And while the Atlanteans used their gifts for good at first, they began to grow reckless. They sought power not just for prosperity, but for control. They started creating machines of immense power, controlling forces of nature that no mortal was meant to wield. The line between light and darkness blurred, and the very knowledge that had brought them peace was now starting to take them into chaos. Soon the angels who were supposed to protect the people of Atlantis found themselves standing at the edge of a precipice, watching as the very civilization they had worked to guide began to teeter. Would they intervene to restore the balance, or had they too been corrupted by the temptation of forbidden knowledge? The angels of Atlantis had once been the shining light that led this civilization to greatness, but now they were standing in the shadow of their own creations, unsure if they could hold the darkness at bay. The fall of Atlantis didn't happen overnight. It wasn't just a natural disaster or an act of war. No, it was much deeper than that. It was the collapse of balance, the moment when the angels lost control, when the desire for power overtook their divine mission to protect and guide. Atlantis didn't fall because of external threats. It fell because the angels' guidance had led them too far, and in their pursuit of more, they had lost sight of the very balance that made their world great. As the sun rose over the magnificent cities of Atlantis, the once harmonious relationship between the Atlanteans and their angelic protectors began to shift. What was once a mission of divine guidance and protection slowly morphed into something darker, something far more dangerous. The angels who had been sent to guard the peaceful civilization started to change. What was supposed to be pure became corrupted, as the very beings of light entrusted with the welfare of Atlantis began to bend the rules they were meant to uphold. At first, the influence of these divine protectors seemed harmless enough. They shared with the Atlanteans knowledge of higher realms, giving them glimpses of divine wisdom that were meant to uplift humanity. But then, as time went on, the angels began to share more than just spiritual teachings. They began to offer the Atlanteans knowledge of power, knowledge that should never have been passed down. This wasn't the kind of wisdom meant to bring peace and enlightenment. This was forbidden knowledge, knowledge that could bend the very fabric of reality itself. They didn't just teach the Atlanteans how to connect with the divine, how to heal the sick, or how to achieve spiritual enlightenment. No, the angels revealed something much darker. They showed the Atlanteans how to manipulate the forces of nature, how to control energy, and how to bend the laws of reality to their will. The power they shared was intoxicating. For the first time, the Atlanteans saw the potential to command the elements, to shape the world around them like clay. This wasn't just about mastering the mind or spirit. This was about having the power to shape reality itself. At first, the Atlanteans were grateful. They used the knowledge given to them by the angels to enhance their civilization. They created technologies that allowed them to control the weather, build cities that seemed to touch the sky, and harness energy from sources that no other civilization even dreamed of. They were on the brink of achieving the impossible, a civilization that was untouchable, immortal, and completely in control of its destiny. But as the Atlanteans began to use this forbidden knowledge, something darker began to take root. What started as divine wisdom soon gave way to greed and selfish ambition. The more the Atlanteans learned, the more they began to desire power. The knowledge wasn't just a tool for enlightenment anymore. It was a tool for control, for domination. They weren't just using it to improve their lives. They began to use it to rule over others, to manipulate the very forces of nature and life itself. The angels, who had once served as guardians, now found themselves standing on the sidelines of a civilization on the brink of self-destruction. They had crossed a line. The knowledge they had shared, meant to protect and guide, had now become a poison. They had introduced a darkness into Atlantis that could no longer be undone. As the Atlanteans grew more powerful, the angels could only watch as the people they had once protected began to spiral into chaos. The line between divine guidance and dangerous temptation had blurred, and the angels themselves had become tempters, leading the people of Atlantis further into corruption. The Atlanteans' descent wasn't sudden. It wasn't a single event that marked their fall, but a slow corruption that crept into their civilization, infecting it from the inside out. The power they had gained from the angels' teachings started to consume them. Their desire to control grew until it overtook their desire for peace and enlightenment. The more they sought to dominate, the more they became disconnected from the spiritual truths that had once made their civilization great. The angels' role had shifted from protectors to instigators. They had once been the ones who guided Atlantis toward its great heights, but now they were complicit in its downfall. The knowledge they shared was no longer a tool for wisdom or peace, but a means to gain dominance, to rewrite the natural laws, to control the very world around them. The people of Atlantis began to see themselves as gods, believing that they could shape the future of the earth and the heavens themselves. What followed was inevitable. The corruption spread. It spread through the hearts and minds of the Atlanteans, through their institutions, and through the very foundation of their society. The angels had shown them the path to dominate the earth, but with it came the destruction of the balance between heaven and earth. The power to shape reality, to control life and death, was too much for the Atlanteans to handle. It overwhelmed them. And as the angels stood by, watching their creation unravel, they realized too late that they had gone too far. They had shared knowledge they were never meant to share. They had crossed the line, from being the guides of light to being the catalysts of darkness. They had led the Atlanteans to ruin and were left to witness the downfall of the very civilization they were supposed to protect. The fall of Atlantis didn't come from an external force. It came from within. It came from the corruption that the angels themselves had helped create. The angels, once the guardians of light, became the harbingers of destruction, and the Atlanteans, once the most enlightened of beings, became the victims of their own ambitions. Atlantis, once a shining beacon of wisdom and peace, began to change. What was once a humble, spiritually connected society started to tilt toward a much darker path. Greed crept in slowly, quietly, like a shadow spreading across the land. It was subtle at first, almost unnoticed by the people of Atlantis. But as they gained more power, as the angels revealed deeper and more forbidden secrets, the Atlanteans began to change. The knowledge they had received from the divine wasn't just about spiritual elevation anymore. It was about control. The angels, once the guardians of peace, had shared wisdom that should have been used for enlightenment. But now the Atlanteans were using it for something darker. They weren't simply learning to understand the universe. They were learning to bend it to their will. They began to see the gifts the angels gave them as tools, not for peace, but for domination. The more they learned, the more they craved. The more power they gained, the more their hearts became consumed by ambition. Selfish desires took over, and what had once been a society of spiritual wisdom became a civilization driven by the need for control. The people of Atlantis, who once lived in balance with nature and the cosmos, now sought to manipulate it. The divine knowledge they were given was being twisted, turned into something far more dangerous. They began to create machines of destruction, things the world had never seen before. Machines that could destroy, machines that could control the weather, the seas, and even life itself. The very tools of creation were now being used to wreak havoc. They created devices that could bend the elements to their will, changing the earth itself, causing storms, floods, and earthquakes at will. But the destruction didn't stop there. The Atlanteans didn't just create machines, they started to practice dark magic. They sought to control forces that should have remained untouched, forces that had been reserved for the divine. They began using magic to control the minds of others, to manipulate the very energy of life, and to create monstrous creatures as tools of war. What was once a peaceful and enlightened society was now becoming a kingdom of chaos, ruled by power-hungry rulers who saw themselves as gods. The angels, who had once been protectors, found themselves standing on the sidelines, watching the civilization they had nurtured fall into chaos. They had given the Atlanteans the knowledge to create, but now they were seeing it used for destruction. The angels had shared divine wisdom, but they had not anticipated that it would be misused in this way. The Atlanteans' arrogance and reckless ambition led them to believe they could do no wrong. They were untouchable. They had the knowledge of the gods, the ability to create immense power, and the divine protection of angels. But it all started to corrupt them. As the Atlanteans grew more powerful, their sense of morality began to disintegrate. They started believing that their divine gifts made them superior to everything around them. The earth, other people, even the gods themselves. The more power they had, the more they sought to assert their dominance, not just over nature, but over each other. It wasn't enough to be the most advanced civilization on Earth. They wanted to be the most powerful civilization in existence. This sense of superiority bred recklessness. The Atlanteans didn't stop to consider the consequences of their actions. They were drunk on their power, believing that nothing could bring them down. But, as is often the case with such unchecked ambition, their hubris began to destroy them from within. The very knowledge they had gained, the very powers they had harnessed, started to turn against them. The machines of destruction they had created were not just tools of power, they were tools of their own demise. The dark magic they had practiced began to unravel the very fabric of their society. What had started as a noble quest for enlightenment became a destructive force that ripped apart their civilization. The once harmonious society, guided by angels and divine wisdom, was now tearing itself apart due to the very knowledge that had been given to them. As Atlantis descended into chaos, the angels watched helplessly. They had once been the guides, the guardians, but now they had become the unwitting catalysts for the destruction of the civilization they had sworn to protect. The Atlanteans, filled with greed and arrogance, had used the divine knowledge not to uplift humanity, but to enslave it. The balance that had once been maintained by the angels was now gone, and the Atlanteans' downfall was inevitable. Atlantis, a civilization built on divine knowledge, was collapsing under the weight of its own greed. The knowledge that had once brought them wisdom now led them into darkness. The angels, who had been the ones to share this knowledge, were now witnesses to the fall of Atlantis. The very gifts they had given became curses, and the civilization they had helped to build was now on the brink of ruin. The knowledge of the gods had been misused, and there was no turning back. As Atlantis began to crumble, it wasn't just the physical destruction that signaled the end of the civilization. It was the moral decay, the corruption of a people who had once been in harmony with the divine. The angels could no longer guide them, For the Atlanteans had already lost their way. The very knowledge that had given them power now led them to their own destruction. The angels had taught them the secrets of the universe, but they had not taught them how to handle the responsibility that came with it. And so Atlantis, once the greatest civilization on Earth, disappeared, swallowed by the sea. The angels who had played their part in its rise and fall faded into myth, but the lesson of Atlantis remained. The price of forbidden knowledge is far greater than any of us can imagine. As the great civilization of Atlantis rose to unimaginable heights, it seemed as though nothing could stand in its way. It was a land of light where wisdom, technology, and spirituality intertwined seamlessly. But as the Atlanteans' power grew, so did their ambition, and with it, their corruption. The angels sent to protect and guide them had shared with them the most profound knowledge the universe had to offer. This knowledge, meant to uplift and enlighten, was now being used for something far darker: control, dominance, and power. What was once a divine blessing had become a curse. The angels' knowledge had opened the door to boundless potential, but also to dangerous temptation. The Atlanteans now wielded forces and technologies that allowed them to manipulate nature, alter reality, and create machines of destruction. What they had learned from the angels wasn't just about spiritual enlightenment. It was about gaining control over life itself, over the very fabric of the world around them. And so the civilization that was meant to be the pinnacle of human achievement became a house of cards, precariously built on a foundation of unchecked power and greed. The angels who had been tasked with guiding and protecting Atlantis now found themselves watching, helplessly, as the civilization they had nurtured began to self-destruct. The Atlanteans had become too proud. They believed that with the power granted to them, they were untouchable, that they could do no wrong. They had transcended their humanity, believing they had become gods themselves. And with that belief came a dangerous arrogance. They began to misuse the knowledge they had gained, pushing the boundaries of what was meant to be sacred and using their power for personal gain, for domination and for control. But the very knowledge they had been given was a double-edged sword. It allowed them to control nature, yes, but it also exposed them to forces they were never meant to wield. As they used these divine gifts, they began to see the cracks in their perfect world. The balance that had once existed between the material and the spiritual began to unravel. The very laws that kept their civilization in harmony were now being bent, twisted, and broken. This wasn't just about creating weapons or machines. The Atlanteans began experimenting with dark magic, tapping into forces that should have been left untouched by mortals. The angels, who had been the guardians of wisdom and light, now found themselves standing by as the very civilization they had helped to create was consumed by its own creations. What was once a beacon of hope and enlightenment became a land of chaos and destruction. As the Atlanteans pushed their newfound powers to the limits, they found that the very knowledge they had gained was starting to turn against them. The machines they had built to control nature began to malfunction. Their energy sources became unstable, and their manipulation of reality began to spiral out of control. The power they had once used to create was now destroying everything it touched. It was no longer a blessing. It was a curse. The angels who had once stood at the gates of Atlantis now found themselves standing in the midst of its fall. They had given the Atlanteans the wisdom to become gods, but they had not given them the wisdom to wield such power responsibly. They had shared the divine secrets of the universe, but they had not foreseen the corruption that would come with that knowledge. They had not anticipated that their gifts would become the very thing that destroyed Atlantis. And so the Atlanteans' world began to crumble. The once pristine cities, filled with advanced technology and spiritual enlightenment, were now reduced to ruins. The machines of destruction they had created turned against them, and the magical forces they had unleashed began to tear apart the very fabric of their reality. The angels who had once guided them now realized too late that they had shared too much. They had given the Atlanteans the power to destroy their world, and in doing so they had failed in their divine mission. The fall of Atlantis wasn't caused by any outside force, but by the Atlanteans themselves. It wasn't an enemy invasion or a natural disaster. It was their own recklessness, their own arrogance, and their own greed that brought about their downfall. The angels who had been sent to protect them had inadvertently become the catalyst for their destruction. And as Atlantis sank beneath the waves, lost forever to time, the angels were cast out. Their divine mission had failed. The knowledge they had shared had led to the corruption of an entire civilization. The Atlanteans, once the most enlightened people on Earth, were now lost to history, their story a cautionary tale for all future generations. The fall of Atlantis was more than just the loss of a civilization. It was the loss of wisdom, the corruption of power, and the temptation of knowledge without wisdom. The angels who were meant to be the guides had become the very reason for the destruction of the civilization they had once sworn to protect. And in the end, the Atlanteans paid the ultimate price for their greed, their ambition, and their failure to heed the warnings of the divine. The angels who were meant to be the protectors of Atlantis, who had once stood as guardians of wisdom, became the catalysts of its destruction. The lessons of Atlantis live on as a warning that knowledge and power, when used without wisdom, can be a curse, not a blessing. The story of the fallen angels of Atlantis is not just one of betrayal and destruction. It is a warning that resonates through the ages, a warning about the dangerous temptation of forbidden knowledge, the pursuit of power without understanding its consequences, and the devastating loss of spiritual balance. The angels who were meant to guide Atlantis, who were sent to protect and enlighten, ultimately became the very reason for its downfall. They gave the Atlanteans the keys to unimaginable knowledge and power, but without the wisdom to understand the responsibility that came with it. What had started as a peaceful, enlightened civilization soon spiraled into chaos. Their overreaching ambition, fed by the very knowledge the angels shared, led them to disregard the most sacred law of all: balance. The Atlanteans were not the first, and they will not be the last, to fall into the same trap. For forbidden knowledge often carries a price, one that isn't always immediately visible. The angels, once guides and protectors, fell just as much as the civilization they were sent to protect. They failed not because they didn't have the power, but because they did not understand the delicate balance between light and darkness, between wisdom and recklessness. The angels gave too much. In their desire to guide, they crossed a line. They did not foresee how the Atlanteans would use their divine gifts, not for enlightenment and good, but for domination and control. And when the Atlanteans used this power to manipulate the very forces of nature, it turned on them. The knowledge that was meant to help them thrive was now the very cause of their destruction. What can we learn from this ancient story? What lessons can we take from the rise and fall of Atlantis? First, we must remember that knowledge is never neutral. Knowledge can heal or it can destroy, depending on how it is used. The Atlanteans had the wisdom of the gods, but they did not have the wisdom to wield it. Power, when unchecked by humility and spiritual understanding, always comes with consequences. The angels may have shared this knowledge with good intentions, but they, too, failed to consider the balance between power and responsibility. Second, we learn that greed and arrogance are the greatest dangers to any civilization. When people begin to believe they are invincible, that they can control forces they cannot understand, they are on the road to destruction. Atlantis was a civilization that had everything. It had wisdom, technology, and power beyond imagination. But it was destroyed by its own hubris. The Atlanteans didn't know when to stop. They thought they could master the elements without understanding their true nature. They believed they could control life and death. In the end, it was this unchecked ambition that led to their fall. As we look back at the rise and fall of Atlantis, let it serve as a reminder that every choice we make, whether for wisdom or power, has consequences. And it's not just about what we do, but how we do it. What will we do with the knowledge we've been given? How will we use the power we have in our lives today? Just like the Atlanteans, we must ask ourselves, what is the price of the knowledge we seek? And are we ready to pay it? Now, this story may seem like a tale from ancient history, but it's a story that still has relevance today. The temptations of forbidden knowledge, the dangers of unchecked ambition, and the consequences of losing spiritual balance are just as present in our world as they were in Atlantis. Just look around. There are forces in our world today that seek control, that use knowledge and power for selfish gain. There are leaders, there are technologies, there are ideas that when misused, have the potential to cause destruction on a scale we cannot even imagine. And we, as a society, must ask ourselves, how do we wield the knowledge we have? How do we use the power that is at our fingertips? The angels of Atlantis were not perfect. They were divine beings, but even they had their failings. Their story is a lesson, a warning, but it is also a reflection of ourselves. If we are to avoid the fate of Atlantis, we must learn from their mistakes. We must seek balance, humility, and responsibility in all that we do. We must remember that knowledge, when used without wisdom, leads to ruin. And when we strive for power, we must always ask ourselves, is this the right path? Atlantis is gone, but the lessons it left behind, the ones taught by the rise and fall of that once great civilization, are still here. They live on in the choices we make every day, in the paths we choose to follow, and in the ways we interact with the knowledge and power we possess. We stand on the brink of our own destiny, just as the Atlanteans did, and it's up to us whether we will follow the path of wisdom or fall into the same traps that destroyed their world. If you found this story fascinating, don't forget to like this video and leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. Do you think we're repeating the mistakes of Atlantis today? Also, don't forget to subscribe to keep exploring more hidden truths and ancient mysteries with us. Until next time, stay curious,